Welcome to The Third Story. I'm Leo Sidran. Again and again, the message is clear. Music is not only a form of expression, it's also a mode of transportation. It's astounding how many people's lives have been completely transformed by their relationship with music. And sometimes the simplest experiences we have as kids can profoundly alter the course of everything that follows. In the case of Andy Narell, a few seemingly unrelated events during his early childhood in New York helped to lay out a path for him to follow, and it's one that he's still following today. Those events included Joseph McCarthy's Red Scare, a rise in gang violence in Harlem in the 1960s, and the innovations of a musical instrument maker from Trinidad named Ellie Mannette. Andy Narell is known as one of the most celebrated, if not the most celebrated, steel drum player in the world. Throughout a career spanning over 5 decades, he's contributed to both the development of steel drum music and to the development of the drums themselves. He's appeared on hundreds of records and film scores. He's been the subject of 2 documentary films himself. He's made nearly 20 records as a leader or a co-leader. He's an educator, an advocate, and an ambassador for the music, culture, and traditions of Trinidad, where steel drums, or pans as they're called, were born. If you've ever heard the sound of steel drums on a record or in a movie, chances are you've heard Andy Narell. His eventual partnership and friendship with Ellie Mannette, the so-called father of the steel drum, lasted until Mannette's death in 2018. What you hear behind me is Narell's Etude for Ellie from his 2017 album, We Kind of Music. Although We Kind of Music is still Andy's most recent formally released album, he did in fact put out another project last year called Like a Child, where he performs all the steel drum parts using a sample library that he spent years developing with Mannette. It's called Steel Pan's Ellie Mannette Collection, and Andy believes that it has the potential to transform the future of the steel drum. Andy Narell's contribution to steel drums is immeasurable. His love of the music and the culture of Trinidad is huge, and his friendship with Ellie Mannette seems to have been one of the most important relationships of his life. But beyond all that, beyond all the technical, musical, or even the historical details, Andy is an example of someone whose devotion and love for a thing took him around the world, and the steel drum was his mode of transportation. We talked last year in Madison, Wisconsin, when I was home visiting my family, and he was in town for a week as a visiting artist. During our talk, Andy not only shared his own personal story with me, but also the story of the steel pan itself, the trajectory of calypso music from Trinidad to the UK and the US and then back to Trinidad, and where he fits in that story. I saw him again shortly after that when he came to see me play with my own band, because when he's not on the road, he splits his time these days between Paris and St. Lucia. Third-story.com is the place to go to sign up, subscribe, and check the archive featuring hundreds of conversations with other folks who have traversed space and time through music and art. Visit wbgo.org/studios to check out all their award-winning content, including this very podcast, which is made in collaboration with them. And then it's patreon.com/thirdstorypodcast, where you can go to throw a coin into my wishing well. Music will also be a mode of transportation for me personally this season. I'll be doing shows in New York and then across Europe to present my new record, What's Trending, which comes out March 10th. Check out leosidran.com to see my trajectory. Without further ado, here's me and Andy Narell talking it down in Madison. Andy Narell, I never know where to start with somebody like you because you have such an extensive and broad history and so many great stories to tell. So I think I want to start by talking about what you're doing this week in Madison, Wisconsin as the artist in residence. I think maybe it speaks a little bit to a part of your life that is spent teaching and advocating for what you do.
Yeah, it's been an interesting week. It's been filled with rehearsals and concerts just about every day. I came here, actually, the people that brought me here, the idea was from people that have studied steel band music with me.
Yeah.
And there's a steel band here in Madison called Panchromatic, and they're playing, learning part of their repertoire is music that I've composed for steel orchestra. And so they wanted to bring me here to do, rehearsals, workshops, work with the band and play concerts. And then things kind of filled out where I'm also playing with a group that's called Caribou, and that's led by Harvey Wirt and Etienne Stadwick, who are both from Suriname. And that has a lot to do with the character of that band. And I've been playing with them. I did a duet concert with your dad, Ben Sidran, who was an old friend of mine. And there's a jam session tonight, and so on. And tomorrow night we're going to play a whole concert of my music. We're going to play. I'm going to play an hour set with a jazz combo, like piano, bass, drums, vibes, congas, percussion, and then we're going to play another set with the steel band playing music that I write for steel orchestra. So, which is something I do. That's kind of how a lot of my work is divided between small jazz ensembles and large steel orchestras, which can range up to 100 players or more.
Is this kind of thing typical for you or common for you to go to a place and sort of spend some time with the local musicians and also play some of your own original music with them?
Yeah, usually it's not so many different things.
Yeah.
I'm usually, typically, I'll travel somewhere, often by myself, and put a band together, a jazz group, and play a concert like that. Or I'll go and I'll be traveling and I'll be teaching at universities where I teach steel band music, and it's all orchestral music that I've composed, and I do rehearsals, master classes, and a concert, and then just go to the next school and do it again. Different repertoire everywhere, and so it often is mixed. I just came from doing one at University of North Texas, where I was playing with working with the steel band and with the percussion ensembles, and also a jazz concert with Paquito de Rivera and Mark Walker, where we kind of brought back the Caribbean Jazz Project. And
is there a part of you when you find yourself teaching at universities and conservatories that, I don't know, marvels at how far this instrument has come and the music around it in the space of 60, 70 years? I mean, in your lifetime, this whole thing kind of has unfolded.
First of all, you have to go back to the beginning, and that's where the real miracle of creation was. I mean, this thing, the very first steel bands were teenage kids in the 1939 parading through the streets in Trinidad, beating on metal. Biscuit tins, paint cans, garbage cans, pieces of junk from cars, brake drums and stuff. And in the 40s, they discovered they could actually tune a few notes on the top of a paint can, and it went from being pure rhythm to kind of polytonal rhythm. And Ellie Mannette, who made my instruments, was the first person to tune the notes of a scale on top of a 55-gallon oil drum. And that was in the late 40s, and he went on the radio and played a melody. And what happened was an explosion of creativity and trying to work with this idea all over the island. And in 15 years, they created all the voices of the orchestra, and they had become symphonic and chromatic, all the instruments chromatic. We could go back to, even 1951, when it was the first time a steel band from Trinidad went abroad to England and France to play. And it was called TASPO, the Trinidad All-Steel Percussion Orchestra.
They play on oil drums, the Trinidad All-Steel Percussion Orchestra, on instruments called ping-pongs, kittles, booms, and cutters. Beating pan, they call it, and it's a fascinating performance, calypsos and all.
For me, oh, look of misery, wherever I meet Johnny, all you people will be sorry to see the grave for Johnny and the gallows there for me.
And they hired a guy to direct the group who was a big band director, a guy who worked with horn sections and stuff like that. And he saw that there weren't enough notes in the low pans, that there were a lot of notes missing, and not enough to play all different kinds of chord changes and stuff. And the fortunate thing is that there were the two most creative tuners at the time were Ellie Mannette and Tony Williams. They were both in the band. And Ellie created a 3-drum bass, a bass instrument because they have large notes once you get down in the lower
so you
register.
Can't put it into two
So,
drums.
the bass was originally 1 note and 2 and so on. And now he created one that could play more bass lines and chords. And Tony created a double cello. And that was just a breakthrough. And by the end of that decade, all the instruments were chromatic.
What kind of music was happening in Trinidad before the steel pan?
Calypso music, yeah. Calypso was already happening. From the early 20th century, Calypso had taken hold. The Calypso went through a similar development in in the same space of time, because if you look at it in the 20s and 30s, most of the Calypsonians were singing the same thing. They were singing different lyrics, but they were using a form like ex-tempo form where they would play the same music over and over, and then they would just improvise new lyrics or compose new lyrics. And the real breakthrough in the music was a guy named Lord Kitchener. Aldwin Roberts was his real name, and Lord Kitchener was his calypso name. And he went to England in 1948 and discovered jazz and bebop music. And he spent 10 years there, and he and a group of very, very talented Trinidadian musicians, they just got locked into the scene there, and they started playing with jazz musicians and cutting all their records there.
London is the place for me. London, this lovely city. You can go to France or America, India, Asia or Australia, but you must come back to London City.
Calypso music in that time period underwent a transformation from kind of simple form, 3-chord music to long form, long melodies, just like standards, just like jazz standards today. You know, you listen to a song like, you listen to Stella by Starlight, and you listen to Kitchener's Margie, and you'll hear, wow, it just, this music became jazz. And they also brought the big band sound in.
Yes.
The horn sections, and calypso music was transformed.
Margie, girl, you always making row. You could beg, you could please, you must listen now. You always wanted me to make you so happy. Well, darling, I'll find the solution to your desire and ambition.
I mean, it sounds like in part because Trinidad was a part of the British Empire, that the relationship and the point of contact with more contemporary sounds like jazz came from England, not from the States necessarily, but as you describe it, it came when the Trinis went to England and found it over there.
And Kitchener was over there, and he wrote a song about Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie called Bebop Calypso. So they were listening to the American music, but it was in London and Manchester where they were playing.
This bebop music is really terrific. This bebop music is really terrific. Well, I nearly went crazy when I heard the record of Gillespie. It really enchanted me just to hear him play anthropology. Yes, sir.
Okay, so meanwhile, in the 1950s, another I think will turn out to be an innovation in the evolution of steel pan emerges in New York, and that is that you are born in the 1950s in New York City.
I was born in 1954. So, but that didn't affect steel band music right away.
For a while. Tell me, how do you, a Jewish kid from New York, find yourself playing the music of Trinidad and these instruments and this?
In a way, it all goes back. It all goes back to Joe McCarthy, because my dad got blacklisted. He was headed for the teaching profession. He was trying to get a doctorate in education and go on to be a teacher and educator. And he got kicked out of the profession for being his communist activities.
Yes,
and. So he bounced around a whole lot of jobs and eventually fell into social work by way of one of his old friends from the party, who found him a job in Harlem on experimental project on how to deal with gang warfare. And so he started dealing with gangs and heroin right from the, and that was like the late 50s.
What were the gangs? Puerto Rican gangs?
Well,
black
in
gangs?
Harlem, both, yeah. And he, I actually was too young to really know what was going on with the Harlem thing. But then he moved to the Lower East Side.
Yeah,
and it was a place called the Educational Alliance, which had originally been a Jewish settlement house on the Lower East Side. All the ethnicities had settlement houses to help their people adjust, the immigrants, and this one had been converted to. Its purpose had been converted to serve the new immigrants, who were mostly blacks from the South and Puerto Ricans. And that's who was living in the housing projects, and that's who the kids in the gangs were.
Yeah.
And I used to go I was very young. I was, we're talking about being 7 years old now, and I would go with him to work and hang out, play ball, and or we'd get on a bus and go to the beach with everybody or something, Rockaway. And they had a summer camp that they were running where they got the kids out of the city and out to the country for a while. And there was a guy who wasn't working out as a counselor. And instead of just firing him outright, they asked him what else he knew how to do. And what else? And he said, I know how to play steel pans, and I know how to make them too. And he was from Antigua. And my father had seen a band play once. That was it. He'd seen a little steel band once, and he ventured, let's try it. Let's hire this guy, see what happens with it. And he made one set of pans, and he taught one group, and they were out playing gigs. Everybody wanted to do it when they saw it, all the kids. And within a year and a half, they had launched 20 steel bands in 2 rehearsal rooms with 2 sets of pans. And by 1962, he had organized the first steel band festival in America. And I was playing already. He became obsessed with the thing. It was like, this is the greatest idea ever. And the interesting thing was that he didn't know that the steel band had been created by kids in gangs when he hit on this idea that this would be something that might interest the kids. And but basically what happened was he brought some home and we started playing as a family, and we pretty well kicked my parents out as fast as we could. We got some friends to form a steel band, my brother and I and our friends. And my father managed us, got us gigs, drove us around. We were just kids. And between in the 60s, I played about 800 steel band gigs before I had finished high school.
Did you relate to music before that? I mean, you found the steel pan when you're 7 years old, but I mean, were you musical in any way before that? Did you play
a little bit?
else?
I was starting to play piano when I was 6, and I played piano all along. But the pan kind of took off for me. It was just like an intuitive thing. I started playing the bass, and I started playing a very simplified bass instrument. It had 4 notes on it, and I wasn't very good at it. And but then I kind of drifted over to the pan that was playing the melody, the tenor pan, and realized that I could just play it. That was it. I heard the melodies that we were playing, and I could just play them. And so I became the front man in the band, the lead player, And from the time I was 8 years old, that was what I was doing.
I heard you say at this concert that you did with my dad the other day that you first fell in love with the pan, and then you heard jazz and improvised music, and you thought, I want to learn how to improvise. And since the steel pan was your instrument, it seemed pretty clear to you that you wanted to learn how to improvise on that instrument.
Yeah, that's pretty accurate. We were playing steel band music, and I guess I was about 13 or so. I think my parents got me an AM/FM radio.
Yeah.
And I started listening to WLIB. I discovered that they were broadcasting from Harlem, and they had DJs like Dr. Billy Taylor, who just completely opened up my mind to not only the music but the people that were making that music. And that was the first time I felt like, yeah, I want to be like them. I want to do that. How do you do that? And I didn't really, know much about it. I was just starting to improvise, and I remember there was a guy that came to play with us. He was a very good guitar player, and he was playing with a lot of people and just playing with us to pay his rent. And he kind of pulled me aside and said, you maybe you know a little more than you think you know, and like you ought to come down and try to sit in. And he invited me down, and I went down to the Village on a Sunday afternoon and sat in at a jam session that was being run by a bass player named Major Holly, who's a great bass player.
Where was the session? At the Gate?
No, it was called Jacques, and it was on Bleecker Street.
Yeah.
It was a block down from the Village.
The Gate, that was it. The Gate.
The Village Gate.
Yeah.
I didn't know much repertoire, but I had a good ear, and I knew a few tunes. They would always call St. Thomas when I walked in, so I knew that was coming.
Do you think the steel pan does lend itself to that, to hard to find the way to swing? You definitely are a swinger on the instrument, but I was thinking as I saw you play it, is there something about the straighter feel or the less swung feel?
I don't know. I think it's cultural.
Yeah.
And I've never been really much of a bebop player,
Yeah.
and it never really worked on that very much. It wasn't what I wanted to do, or
Yeah.
and somehow I guess I've the more I've grown as an improviser, I think I've kind of like simultaneously grown my harmonic and melodic vocabulary into the jazz idiom,
Yeah.
but at the same time feeling the swing of Afro-Caribbean music
Yes.
as being more suited to what I like to do,
Yeah.
or what I play better.
Yeah.
And so I just went that way, and it's worked.
So you go down to the session on a Sunday afternoon, and you know some tunes, sort of, and you play St. Thomas. And what was the reaction in general, though, of the musicians in New York?
Well, the funniest was Major Holly, the guy that was hosting it. He was quite a bit older and really from a jazz background, and he was just mystified by me. He couldn't figure it out.
Yeah.
He would, and he didn't have my name
Yeah.
ever correct or anything like that, but he would call me things like the black man's white man.
Yeah.
I was 15 years old, and so it was rather odd. I mean, I was breaking new ground. I was trying to play jazz on pan, and that, there's a few instances of it before that where, like, there's a record that I still love from the Invader Steel Band in around 1960 or so, and there was a guy named Cobra Jack in the band who he played a beautiful bebop solo on one of the tunes, and it's still one of my favorite pan solos ever recorded. And I kind of wonder, like, was he listening to the radio, or did they have records, or did he have access to those records? Because the bebop language is there. He's like blowing a beautiful swing solo on a calypso. So and the more I've found in older records and research stuff, I've been hearing that there were improvisers in Trinidad in the 50s already. So they must have been hearing it.
Yeah.
And but as far as actually wanting to be a jazz musician, I was sort of breaking new ground. I mean, there wasn't anybody doing it. I didn't have a model to follow.
This thing about the black man's white man, as out there as it might sound, I think I know what he's talking about. I mean, what you describe is a deeper and deeper relationship that continues to this day with black culture, or Afro-Caribbean culture, as you say. But it starts at 7 years old, when you basically are hanging out at this camp with a bunch of kids who have a very different background from you. And I wonder if, as you were falling in love with the instrument and deepening your relationship with it, if part of what was happening also was your approaching black culture and finding a way to discover yourself within it.
It was the 60s.
Yeah.
It was the civil rights movement. My parents were very political from the time they were in college, and they were very involved with civil rights and socialism and communism and all these ideas. My dad, at this point, my parents were very anti-communist at this point.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah, terribly. The most anti-communist people are the people that feel like they got burned by the communists.
Is it fear or anger? Disillusionment?
Anger
or
and
fear?
disappointment.
Yeah.
My mom grew up in a very idealistic family in Poland, and they were her father and her uncles were all either socialist, communist, Zionist, everything. And she actually worked for her uncle, who was the Polish ambassador to the UN
Wow.
in the late 40s, and she was his secretary, and she She knew he was improvising a lot of stuff that he was saying. It wasn't a fact. But it really didn't hit her until she went back there and she saw how terrible things were for people there.
Yeah.
And how the elites had everything. And it was a police state. And she came back and talked my father out of the whole thing, out of their whole involvement. And she wrote a book about it.
Mm-hmm.
And subsequently they tried to expel my mom from the country. I mentioned McCarthy and that whole thing. My dad was subpoenaed by the House Un-American Activities Committee and blacklisted and all that stuff. But my mom also, they gave her a deportation notice, which she had to fight for a number of years before she became a citizen. And I found out later that the FBI had 1,000 pages on my parents.
And they sound like as political as they were
just ordinary people.
Just teaching steel
That
band.
was J. Edgar Hoover.
Yeah.
You know, this was a massive spying campaign, and at that time it was communists, and then it became the civil rights people, and then the Black Panthers, and he just went after them one after the other, the enemies of America. You know.
Well, as much of an American artist as you are, I mean, you know, in today's calendar, you spend half the year in France and the other half in St. Lucia. I know you spent a lot of time in the Bay over the years, but I mean, do you think some of that influenced your decision not to spend time in the States or not want to be here? You chose to live abroad ultimately.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't move over there until 20 years ago. I mean, I lived in the U.S. I lived 30 years in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I grew up in New York.
Yeah.
But it's given me a different perspective and seeing kind of, you know, people think because I'm abroad that I don't know what's going on here. And it's like, come on, we got the internet, you know.
Yeah.
It's the same news you're reading. I'm reading the New York Times, you know. But being outside the country has given me a little bit different perspective on what's happening here. And I'm glad to not be here.
Yeah.
I mean, I am in America a lot. I'm enough here to stay in touch. My kids are out in California. My grandkids are in California. Yeah. And so I spend a lot of time here and I work here. I teach at a lot of universities. I spend time with my family. But I'm also glad to be out of it. Yeah. In a way. I live in, I spend 6 months a year living in a little fishing village that has no corporations and no traffic. And none of the big time development where we are, and then I live in another part of the year in Paris, which is like one of the most. It's like New York, but different. Yeah. It's like one of the most diverse cities in the world. And for me as a musician, it was a fascinating place to go because the mix of it's the center of the world for African music, and then you have this whole Caribbean population of the people who aren't in America really aren't hip to this, like. How much incredible music is coming out of Martinique and Guadeloupe, and La Réunion, Reunion Island, and places like that. And then there's this whole mix of people I play with in Paris and get to listen to and play with and interact with. Yeah. They're from North Africa, they're from West Africa, they're from the French Caribbean, and there's Cubans and Brazilians and people from all over the world, and Americans and French players, and so. It's musically, culturally, in many ways, it's good to experience something else. I had to become fluent in French, which was I always wanted to do and wasn't doing while I was here. I could study a little, but I wasn't getting fluent. Yeah. And I went over to play with some musicians from Martinique and Guadeloupe, Mario Canoge, Michel Alibo, and Jean-Philippe Fanfan. And I went over to teach at a steel band school in Paris called Calypso Session. And I was also teaching around some other parts of Europe. But I got involved with Calypso Session. And then I met the woman that I subsequently married. And I stayed, you go over for the music and stay for the woman.
I don't think you're the first, and nor will you be the last to tell that story.
No, definitely not.
But I mean, I guess the reason I framed the question the way I did is because, in talking about even your discovery of the instrument, you start with McCarthy. And again, in asking you the question about what it was like to interact with the Black community, the Afro-Caribbean community, your answer leans political, and you talk about, like, the nature of the family that you grew up in, and how maybe that like opened up, your willingness to embrace people that didn't look like you,
I think I was always comfortable with it,
Yeah.
in terms of and that I have my father to thank for that,
Yeah.
Because he took me to work with him and he brought those guys home and my kind of his third adopted son was one of the Puerto Rican kids from the neighborhood who became like my big brother, and so, but then, in my teens, I just realized it was like the music that I was into was like the pop music was Motown.
Yeah.
Of course, the Beatles and stuff like that, but it was like really Motown was what was happening, and then jazz, and I started all the people that I wanted to be like, all the people that I wanted to that I thought sounded the hippest, it was just almost all black people,
Yeah.
Yeah. Miles and Coltrane and Herbie and Wayne Shorter and Cannonball Adderley and Thelonious Monk and Art Blakey and Elvin Jones and Tony Williams and finally, Bill Evans, okay. You know what I mean? But it was like all these giants that I looked up to and wanted to, it was the first people to inspire me to want to be like somebody.
Yeah.
They were all black people, and these great black musicians and sports was the other area, I mean, it was basketball. That's the sport I've always loved and watched and stuff. So, and that was the period when, black people took over professional basketball, basically. I was living through Bill Russell, as a Knick fan,
Sure. Inevitably, you had to go to Trinidad, right? I mean, this instrument, your instrument came from Trinidad. You spent, your high school years playing 800 gigs or whatever it is that you said but at some point you're going to have to go to Trinidad and see it. When did you first go there?
I was 12 years old the first time I went. It was 1966, and we played as guest artists, like an opening act on the National Music Festival, which was a competition for 30-piece steel bands.
Yeah.
And they were playing all like mostly classical music at that festival.
On the steel pan?
Yeah, sure. That's something that came about. The first steel band to actually play a classical... Well, the first steel bands playing classical music were called bomb tunes. It was in the 1950s. And they would... For Carnival, they would arrange like classical music or pop tunes in calypso rhythm and go out and play them on the road. And it was done for shock value and to get public and people. And it's remained. The bomb tune is still part of not only part of steel band music, but a big part of what I do. When you talk about me playing a jazz tune with a calypso swing, that's what I'm doing.
A bomb tune.
It's all it relates. It all relates back to bomb tunes. You have a pop tune like "Hello, young lovers, wherever you are," right? And they will go bum ba dum, bum ba dum, bum ba dum, bum bum bum, bum bum ba dum, bum 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 bum. They turn it into four. They'll turn it into a calypso swing, and there was that. But then the first band to come along and play a classical piece, really like interpreted as a classical piece, was a group called the Pan Am North Stars. And I mentioned this guy, Tony Williams. He was a tuner, and he was the leader and captain of the band. He tuned the pans, and he arranged all the music. And they were like, there's never been a better playing band, in my opinion. This band was just fantastic. And there's a clip of them on YouTube playing Voices of Spring on Ed Sullivan. In 1964, which was that first piece. They did it at the 62 Music Festival.
Yeah.
Now from Trinidad, here to appear in the Caribbean Calypso Carnival at Carnegie Hall, Anthony Williams World Championship Steel Band and Limbo Dancers. So let's have a wonderful welcome for our Trinidadians.
It was a revolutionary period. And so all in the 60s, what happened was they had these classical music competitions where all the bands would come and play straight interpretations of classical music. And they also developed the festival called Panorama, which began in 1963. And what that was looking for bigger audiences and bigger venues. And so they started with this competition, and by the end of the 60s, they had 100-piece bands. You know, it just exploded, this whole thing.
Well, so there's a part of the development of the instrument that is very musically rich and interesting. And then there's this other part of it which is more community oriented. And, you know, like I heard you say the other day on stage, and I can hear that it goes all the way back to the development of the instrument in your telling of the story, that there's a kind of pacifying element about steel bands, right? That wherever, you said the other day on stage, wherever there are steel bands, there's a kind of an eradication or a limiting of violence among the people that are interested in it.
I don't know I wouldn't call it pacification so much as it breaks down a lot of barriers between people. What happened was in the beginning, steel bands were tough black kids, poor kids from the poor neighborhoods, all right? It was all black, all male, all young. And they carried weapons with them, not guns, but they carried knives with them, and they would meet up in the streets and they'd have a clash. They would literally fight and send people to the hospital. And they didn't include anyone else. It was just the gangs, you know. And in the 50s, they started to get popular, and more people wanted to play the music. Yeah. Women wanted to play, and they were excluded from the band, so they formed all girl bands. Yeah. There was a steel band called Dem Boys, and their sisters all wanted to play, so they started a group called Dem Girls, you know. And there was another called Girl Pat, and they were very well known. Ellie Mannette worked with them, and so they had you had this, and then you had some of the middle class kids and the lighter skinned kids. All these social distinctions and stuff. It's a very diverse society. Trinidad is black and Indian and white and mixed and Chinese and Middle Easterns and Europeans all thrown together. And as steel bands began to become more inclusive, by the 60s, women were starting to break into the band. It was the racial barriers were starting to break down. Yeah. And by the 70s, it was really women were in the bands. So, and what you see in steel band music is like a breakdown of the barrier between professional and amateur. These are amateur orchestras where amateurs can play at a world-class level. And male and female, and black and white and Indian and Chinese and young and old, and everybody could play together in these community orchestras that were like striving to be the best in the world, you know, and were literally starting to go on world tours and perform for everybody. And for some reason, steel band music seems to have this kind of an effect wherever it goes, you know. I mean, it's a kind of music and an instrument where it's accessible. I can take a group of beginners and have them sounding like a beginning steel band in 1 hour, you know, playing a tune. People that have never played the instrument before, and they can play together in the space of that first hour. And then you can spend the rest of your life trying to learn how to excel at it, just like any other instrument, and it has all that potential. So it's a really remarkable story, and in Trinidad, these gangs went from street fighting gangs to like world-class orchestras having musical competitions instead of fights. Yeah, and you know, one of the things when you said pacification, I was like, you know, it's funny because they still kind of treat these competitions like it's a war. You know, it's the only place I know where a music concert is referred to as a war.
They call it a war.
Yeah. The Panorama is war. Yeah. You can ask anybody about that. And I think it's the culture is changing, but I have personally been in pan yards the night before finals and heard a half an hour war speech inspiring the soldiers to go out there and take no prisoners the next day, you know. And it's you can feel the old guard where they came from. Yeah. You know, those were the old guys that came up through the gangs, and they were suspicious of anybody coming around. It was very, very secretive. The bands, they would, if another players from another band came by to listen to them practice, they would consider them spies. They came here to steal the music, stuff like that.
They came to steal our stuff.
Yeah,
How were you viewed, though? I mean, you went for the first time when you were 12 years old, but how have you been viewed, and what has the relationship been for you personally, like in Trinidad?
Yeah, there's always been people that are suspicious of me.
Yeah.
Here's this white guy from who's not from here who's taken the pan, and some people think I've just taken their thing and made a personal success for myself out of what they created. But I think what happened early on was that people from Trinidad could really see that that I loved them, that I loved this instrument, I love the music, I love the people, and that I'm an ambassador for them, and that they would come to my gigs and hear me talking about Trinidad and Pan and the story behind it and telling all these international audiences about it, and they'd have to revise their
Suspicions.
pre-thinking bias about me, about this guy. And so many of my friends are in Trinidad, from Trinidad, and my closest friends, personal relationships, working relationships. And then I have this whole bond with the people, and through representing them, that it has really changed my relationship with people. And the other thing is that I didn't go back for 20 years after that first trip I made. So, but once I went back in the mid-'80s, I was constantly there every year.
What kept you from going back for those 20 years?
Well, I was just a kid, and I spent the next period of time kind of going through my life, which was at first not really headed into music. When I went to college, I was a pre-med, which was sort of what was expected of me. You're supposed to go to medical school and find a cure for cancer and win the Nobel Prize,
And that's what took you
normal expectations for a Jewish
kid,
kid from New York.
That's what took you to Berkeley, though? Is that where you went first?
Well, I didn't. I moved to the Bay Area, and that's why I went to UC Berkeley.
Pre-med.
I was a pre-med, but then I switched to music and composition. By the time I was done with school, I finished with a music major. And I feel like, when I got out of school, that's when I really began my music education. Starting to learn about Afro-Cuban music and Brazilian music and jazz and just it hasn't stopped. I'm studying all the time. I've
had a couple of East Bay related conversations for this podcast. One was with Dave Garibaldi, who described the East Bay in the 60s and 70s as being this wonderful, rich coming together of a lot of, different styles of music and ethnicities, and that they were all Latin music and black music and jazz. And it was really coming together at that time.
The funk was, a lot of funk was born in the East Bay.
Yeah.
When you look at Tower of Power and Graham Central Station and all those kind of bands, and then you have the whole rock scene and the jazz scene was, and a lot of people were playing Latin music, jazz, Latin music, fusion, So, it was a real melting pot and a good place to be at that time.
And were you absorbed into the local scene there at first when you got there?
Somewhat, a little bit. I was going to school, and when I first got there, I was 15 when I moved, all right? And I went down to an interview with Parks and Recreation in Oakland with a director, one of the directors there at Oakland Parks and Rec. And I went with my father, and he proposed starting a steel band program there. He said, we have the Pans, And she said, who's going to teach? And he was like, him, So and she went for it. That was the amazing thing. She went for it. And
so your whole family moved to
I moved with my family.
Got it, to California.
And so on my 16th birthday, I was at the DMV taking my driver's test, and I think that night or the next night I was at work, and I was teaching in a community center. So I was teaching steel band music all through college. And then, it was during that time that I started playing studio sessions. When I got out there, I I started playing kind of one track on various albums for David Rubinson, who was a big producer at that time. He ultimately was a producer for all of Herbie Hancock's big records, and I played on albums for Taj Mahal and Phoebe Snow and the Pointer Sisters and Patti LaBelle and Peter, Paul, and Mary. A lot of different artists that he was producing over the years.
So he liked the sound of the steel drum. He liked
liked having
quality.
one track here and there, you know.
I spent last summer on an island in the Mediterranean Sea. The sunshine was so bright, child, you know it burned me down to my soul. I wish everybody that I knew.
But it was also my introduction to my first real introduction to engineering,
Yeah.
you know, because Fred Katera was engineering all those records. And he was the guy that had done Blood, Sweat, and Tears in Chicago and Janis Joplin around that time. So a very influential cat. And I worked with him a lot and with Roy Halley, who came out there to the Bay Area. And, you know, there were some good engineers in the Bay Area
Sure.
also. I got a break with, I was playing Pan on the street when I was 18, and Bernie Krause heard me play, walking by, and he said, "Give me your phone number, you know, or call me tomorrow or something." And Bernie was part of the synthesizer pioneer. He and Paul Beaver were the first guys to play synths on L.A. sessions, and they taught a lot of the people in L.A. And they also wrote the Nonesuch Guide to Electronic Music and put out a few albums. But Bernie was not a keyboard player. He needed somebody to play keyboards for him. And I sort of became his synth player, but also he let me arrange. And he was producing a lot of commercials at the time, and he let me learn on the job. I was writing rhythm section, horns, strings, background vocals.
Yep.
And it was real school because we would go in, you know, they didn't have drum sets in the studios in those days. You had to bring everything in, the drum sets, the amps, everything. And we would cut like rhythm section. We'd do a 30-second version and a 60-second version.
Yep.
And then we'd do strings, horns, background vocals, lead vocals, narration, synth overdubs, mix, all in one day.
Yeah.
And so that was production school for me. Yeah. And I was like 19 years old. You know, I was getting into it. I was just out of school, and it was a big break. The last job that I did with Bernie before he changed professions was Apocalypse Now. We worked on that for a month together on the score.
Really?
And then he changed professions and went into field recording of. He helped create this whole new field of studying the environment by listening to it, and has made tens of thousands of recordings of out in nature, wildlife. You know, the idea is you go to the same place year after year, the same date, the same time of day, and you record it, and you listen to it, and you can hear species disappearing that way. And you can see it. They have he uses a program called Audition. Adobe makes it. And it gives you a spectral analysis of the whole frequency range. And you can actually see all the different species.
By frequency?
Yeah, but they have a certain kind of, you know, shape.
Yeah.
And they're in a certain frequency range.
Yeah.
And you can, once you know, and so part of his expertise is in biology and zoology is to learn about what he's listening to.
Yeah.
And, you know, to study what's happening out there in the environment. Bernie has said that like about half of the habitats that he's studied have disappeared. You know, and but you can actually you might take a photo of this place and it looks the same.
Yeah.
But you listen to it,
it's changed.
You can hear how it's changed, and so it's a whole new field of study.
Yeah.
He wrote a very interesting book that I read called "The Great Animal Orchestra."
Yeah.
Which talks about how how it's essential for all these animals to be heard, and so they're all singing and talking and making noise, and they all have to be heard by their own. And so there needs to be a certain balance out there, just like in an orchestra.
Yeah, sure.
If one species is covering up another, it doesn't work. You know,
there needs to be space for everyone.
I used some of his tracks on an album recently. I did some music with the sampled pans, it's called Jungle Music. It's on an album I did called We Kind of Music.
Yeah.
And the animals are a big part of the whole soundtrack of that song.
One thing that I hear in that experience of being invited to play keyboard and arrange in production school, as you just describe it, is that it probably gave you a window into how you could compose and produce and arrange and then bring it back into the steel pan world, because today a big part of your life is not only as an innovative player of the instrument, but also composer and arranger of music for the steel pan. So did you take that experience, the studio production school experience, and then apply it immediately to the steel pan?
Absolutely. That was always the goal.
Yeah.
You know, here I am. I have a chance to learn how to record and produce and arrange and all that stuff, and I want to do my music.
Yeah.
You know, I want to be an artist, a recording artist, and a producer. It also got me into producing other people.
Yeah.
Which I have enjoyed a lot.
Yeah.
And you know, I did at one point I had a contract where I could actually sign a few artists and stuff, and I brought Billy Childs in and did 4 records with him, and Ray Obiedo was another, and so on. Real proud of those records. Billy was an amazing artist to work with.
So you were kind of A&R. You could sign.
Kind of like that, yeah. I met Billy and heard his music, and he didn't have a record deal yet.
Yeah.
And I brought him in and proposed that I want to sign this guy. It was that kind of a thing.
What do you think about the way the pan is represented in popular culture, just in terms of what it signals? I mean, I know that you ended up playing on a lot of film scores also, and I can imagine that because you're so interested in recording, and you sort of speak the language of the studio and production, and also the language of the Afro-Caribbean music, that you're the cat to call.
Yeah, and so often you're up against the people's biases about what steel pans are and what they sound like and what they do.
Yes.
And it's like they can only see it in a sort of a cliche Caribbean context.
That's why
and
I asked.
even big time composers have had to deal with that bias. You know, it's not just me. I've always been up against that bias and just kind of butted up against it at every But for example, I started working with James Horner, who in the first film I did for him was 48 Hours, but I did a number of them, and he's the guy that did Titanic and Aladdin, and he's a huge film composer. And James had trouble with the producers. James wanted to use me on the score just because he liked the sound of steel pans. He wanted to put it in the orchestra. He thought it added something really different and unique to the percussion section of the orchestra. And they were like, steel pans, you know? This film's not in the Caribbean.
Yeah. Yes.
You know, you'd more typically hear me like playing the last scene of Trading Places or something like that, where Eddie Murphy and Dan Aykroyd are on the beach. At the end of the whole film, there's one little quick scene where now they're enjoying the Caribbean, and of course there's a steel band back there.
Looking good, Billy Ray!
Feeling good, Louis.
And so I would do those kind of sessions. But James had me in the orchestra playing very atypical music from the beginning.
Yes.
You know, and I got to work with some, really good composers. I worked with him. I worked with Maurice Jarre, Tom Newman, Elmer Bernstein, Michel Colombier, great film composers, And I found more often in the film music that I was being brought in not just to do the typical Caribbean thing.
Well, that speaks to the openness and creativity of those film composers who are able to recognize the color and the potential of the instrument beyond our biases, as you say, the sort of more popular biases. Oh, we must be on the beach.
Right.
But, you have lived through the development of the instrument, the modernization of the instrument, many of the high-fidelity recordings of the instrument. And so, in a sense, the way you hear it is kind of the way that most of us have become familiar with hearing it, too, because you've been such an advocate and ambassador, as you say, for the instrument.
Yeah, I mean, I've done a lot more recordings than anybody else.
Yeah.
And I've kind of developed, I've gotten to work with all the best engineers in the world. And I've seen, articles in Mix magazine, the engineering magazine, where they asked a famous engineer, how do you record steel pans?
Yeah.
And he said, well, I worked with Andy Narell, and this is how he does it.
Yeah, right.
And I was really like, wow, what a compliment, But I've learned from those guys, and they learned from me too, because I'm the one with the hands-on daily experience that's recorded this thing 1,000 times, And I often. Sometimes I butt heads with engineers at gigs who think they know about how to mic up a steel pan because they did it before. I know you probably want to talk about the sample library and stuff, but that's what I did with that, is give you all the different kinds of stereo combinations that I use on my steel orchestra albums.
Yeah.
That's what I'm working with,
So I saw some of the tutorial that you did about this steel pan library, and it's really deep. I mean, it seems like for somebody who loves engineering and also loves steel drums, it must have just been a really fun project to do, because you got to sort of invent the template for how people are going to, I mean, really how most people in production will probably experience what steel drums are.
Yeah, this is going to open up a whole new world for people, because they've got now the whole world will have access to a whole collection of Ellie Mannette's most beautiful instruments, played and recorded and mixed by me.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So, and these are Ellie and I are the combination. We've pretty much kind of set a different kind of standard for the recording pans.
Is Ellie still with us? Or
No, Ellie passed away a few years ago. He didn't get to see the end of this project, but he was involved with it, and he heard some of the demos I was working on as I was working on the project. He was very excited about this project. And basically what it was I heard like all these bad steel pan sample libraries coming out. And
were you ever asked to play on them or anything, or had you been sampled before?
I had been briefly asked sometimes at recording sessions in LA, can I sample your something on your pans? And I was always, no, I'm not, I don't think so. This is Ellie's sound, not mine. And I just kind of dodged the issue because I didn't want to deal with. I didn't want to be the guy that gave away the pans.
But wait, I hear that. I dig that, and particularly when you speak to already the kind of, respect and balance that you try to strike with the originators of the instrument. But it's interesting that you say this is Ellie's sound and not my sound, because that's sort of like saying that the sound of Bird is in the Selmer and not in the player.
Well, but you're literally looking at the inventor. He's like there are 5 different kinds of instruments in this sample library that I did. They're his design, except for one, which the bass, the 6th bass was created by some other guys in Trinidad, but the other 4 designs he invented them.
Yeah.
They're all like his patterns, his designs, and he was the pioneer in like pushing this thing forward and evolving it to perfect it over a period of over 70 years.
Yeah.
And that's quite a career, So, I mean, and the respect I have for all the people in Trinidad who contributed to this and all the pain that they went through to make this happen, I didn't want to be known as the guy that just gave it away.
Yeah.
And I just felt, real mixed feelings about the whole thing. But what finally came back to is seeing all these bad sample libraries out there and hearing all these bad samples on records and stuff like that and synth patches. And one of Ellie's students, Darren Dyke, came to me, and he had figured out how to use Contact Player and had a program in it. And he did a version of a sampled pan and played it for me. It was mono. It wasn't. It was, and it didn't have a lot of dynamic subtleties and stuff, but it was clean. And he said, "You should do this."
Yeah.
And so I went to Ellie and I proposed it to him, and I said, "What do you think? This is what we do. I'm going to sample all your instruments and put it out there, and this will be your instruments will be available to musicians all over the world from now on."
Yeah.
That'd be a part of your legacy, and I promise you'll get royalties, and if there's any money made on this thing, and so on. And Ellie was like, "Let's do it," And so at that point, I had no idea what I was getting into.
Yeah.
I called a friend of mine who had done a big sampling project, and he told me, "Oh, don't do it. Don't."
It's so much work.
Oh yeah, it's way more work than you think it's going to be. It's going to cost you more than you think it's going to cost, and they're going to hack it, and you know, and so on and so on. And so I went right ahead and
Did it.
yeah, I just did it low budget, you know, and it spent, you know, not all my time, but over a period of over 5 years, I was working on this thing, and I had to. It was really the big I knew how to you know, record pans, but how to record them for samples. That's a different way. So a number of ways I approached miking and doing it. But the real education was learning how to get inside this sample player
Yeah.
and figure out what it can do and how it works. And once I got that together, I realized, whoa, the possibilities here are just amazing. You know,
And you said you know, this is common at this point, but one thing is to record it at whatever number of dynamic ranges of your choosing. In your case, it's like 30 ranges or something, right?
yeah, and on average, about 35 to 40 different samples of every note on every pan. So that gives you a lot of very fine tuning subtlety in terms of covering all the dynamics that are possible.
Yeah.
And then the balancing was very tricky. I had to go through, because once you load, we wrote a script that Darren got somebody to write a script where they could create a list of each striking of the pan is now a separate audio file.
Yeah.
And you create a list in order from loudest to softest, and they would load that way into Contact.
Uh-huh.
So, by the way, they would number them.
Yeah.
And but the tricky thing was really balancing these instruments, and I had to do that one sample at a time. So, and there's over 1,000 samples on each instrument, and each one has been evaluated and adjusted to level to balance it with its neighbors, so that,
So it plays
that any
even.
MIDI velocity you play at, it's going to sound like a balanced instrument. So I would use like a fixed velocity on Logic and just play the chromatic scale and make sure it's balanced at every possible MIDI velocity, and that every sample has been looked at in the entire library. And that's how I got to create balanced instruments. And then I balanced them with each other into sections. So you have like this double second that I'm playing, and you have 1, 2, 3, 4. You have different combinations of different numbers of instruments, and each one is panned, meaning left and right, is panned in a way that, so the way I mix my albums. So, and then, you know, it was a whole other ramp up of education when we came time to do the graphic interface.
Yes.
Because I realized, well, the way I'm doing it isn't the way it's going to be set up.
Yeah.
And I had to learn how actually what the architecture is going to be that we're going to use, and how we're going to build this thing, and then I redesigned the whole library to fit this graphic interface.
Knowing that you play piano also, and that you understand what's possible as a piano player, when you play this instrument as if it were a piano, I mean, you said to me earlier, yeah, you can get the whole orchestra across one keyboard, but it also seems like it actually creates a set of possibilities that really aren't possible with the pans.
Right. All of a sudden, I realized, holy cow, I'm creating instruments that don't exist in nature. This is like a whole new thing, you know. And to be able to play a solo, a jazz solo on a whole section of pans and double it in octaves just without having to actually play it in octaves, just like MIDI, you know, or whatever. And it was like, wow, this is a whole new instrument, you know. And more I got into it, it was what became fascinating for me is all the things that I couldn't do before. Not just having access to all these instruments, now they're all in my computer instead of having to travel all around to you know, I was doing steel orchestra albums where I was overdubbing 20-some instruments. I had to play every part of every song and on every instrument, the whole album on 25 instruments, and they weren't all in one place. I'd be in Paris, I'd be in West Virginia, I'd be in California, wherever all these different instruments are being stored. And it was an enormous amount of work. And now I've got all the instruments in my computer, and I can, you know, so that's one thing. But then it's the possibilities that you can create all these new sounds that didn't exist before. And so I did while the pandemic was happening, I was stuck home and I was finishing this library. I also did an album of music to see what I could do with it. And it's basically a steel orchestra album, but I played the whole thing on the keyboards and just have live drums and percussion and some horns and solos.
And when
stuff.
is that coming out? When is that
It's
coming
out. It's on SoundCloud. It's called Like a Child. And it's at my website, too. You can see it there. There's a click, and it's for sale there. But I haven't put it on all the digital distribution yet. But there's a link to the library. There's a page at ilio.com, ILIO, and at that page there's also under the audio demos there's a link to my album, and also Andy Narell, Like a Child. You'll find it on SoundCloud, and I'll put it on Spotify and soon.
I know there are hundreds of stories that I could ask you about, but considering I just learned this one having lunch with you this afternoon, I'd like to ask you to tell it to me again about how you became this record-breaking artist in South Africa, because I think it's, more than anything, probably speaks to the vast, collection of these anecdotes that you probably have, but this idea that you, unbeknownst to you, became a kind of hit maker in South Africa.
Yeah, I first started, getting an inkling of it from the record company. I saw on the royalty statements, like, what's this going on? A couple thousand sales in South Africa. Why am I selling albums there? I didn't even know. And then a guy from South Africa came to a Caribbean Jazz Project gig, and we were playing in Europe. He came backstage. He told me, there's a club in Soweto called the Andy Narell Jazz Club. And I was like, what? And I didn't understand, and he said, yeah, we have these listening clubs. And apparently what was happening is that people were pooling their money. It was the same system they use for making sure that people have enough money for funerals in poor areas. And they were pooling their money to buy CDs and listen to recordings and into these clubs. And one of these clubs had decided to name itself after me, kind of like. So I still didn't have any idea what this means, And as I mentioned to you earlier, I saw Hugh Masekela a few weeks before I went to South Africa, and he told me, there's going to be a lot of people at your gigs, and your music's popular in South Africa now. And I thought that meant a few hundred people might be out there. And apparently what had happened was that it started playing it on the radio, and I'd had they were playing it at all the bars and clubs in the townships, and these people were listening to it. It was on the radio, and I had some hit records over there. And I went to headline a festival called Arts Alive. It was at a place called Zoo Lake in Johannesburg. And it was a free concert, and we were closing the show. I was the headliner, and there were 70,000 people out there. And they started singing along at these songs, and how did this happen? And we went all over the country, and everywhere we went, people were, erupting at the first two bars of songs that I had written, which had never happened to me before in my life, And
this is instrumental music, all instrumental music.
Yeah, we just go bee doo dee dee doo, wow.
Yeah.
Ba da ba boo bee doo doo, wow. People would be cheering. I was like, holy cow! I had no idea, And it was basically an entirely black audience. I hadn't crossed over at all into white culture, as far as I could see.
Do you think they thought you were black when they first heard you?
No, I don't think so. But
what do you think it was about the music that connected with them? Like what was
something
going on?
about the time? It was the end of apartheid. It happened before the elections. It was like the late 80s when this happened, and it was just like. Music was starting to come up from underground. There were some people were still being banned, but they were loosening up the regulations on music, and here was this kind of like fusion of a jazz and Caribbean music and the sound of the pan, and it just hit people. I mean, I don't know why. I went out to Soweto, and I'm in there's hundreds of people in this bar club, and I'm being programmed between Salif Keita and Angelique Kidjo, and I can't figure it out how that can be, you know. But it happened over there, and so I just, you know, I jumped on it. I was like raring to come back, you know. We did a half a dozen gigs on that first trip, and I came back 9 months later and got the band much tighter. We did we did like 14 concerts on that tour. We did a live album, and I've been going back ever since. And some of those people in my band I've been playing with for more than 20 years. Louis Mhlanga is one of the great guitar players in Africa. He's from Zimbabwe, lives in Johannesburg. He's in the band, and it's a fascinating country. I love it.
It seems like over and over again, I mean, a big part of what's happening in your life is that you are an artist and a musician, and you are also, as you said, an ambassador and a kind of an advocate. You know, that there's an aspect of what you do that is a kind of form of advocacy, and there's and respect and storytelling and keeper of this tradition. I mean, you have a kind of very multifaceted, even just focusing on your work with the pan, you know, a very multifaceted life and career that you're dealing with, just built around one instrument.
It's just amazing how these accidents of fate can shape your whole life. And, you know, I look back at, that's why I, you know, sometimes I start the story with Joe McCarthy, you know, because it's such an odd place to start. But it really is the reason that my father ended up in social work, and that's how I ended up in the steel pan.
You know, I think given the nature of life, political and otherwise today, it actually gives me a sense of optimism that maybe 50 years from now, some other great, innovative, creative person will start their story inside one of the darkest political moments of the American experience, which just happened to us right now. I mean, maybe there's some benefit that we can't see, some hidden thing that is going to happen.
We have to hope, and we have to find it. You know, we have to find a way out of this, and I think you know, music is a powerful tool. Music is and it's revolutionary. It brings people together in a way that they don't want us together.
Well, Andy Narell, thanks for getting together with me today and telling me part of the story.
Pleasure. Thank you.
There he was, my friends, Andy Narell. Music is a powerful, revolutionary tool. What a story. I'll be back again in your headspace before you know it. Until then, I'll talk to you soon.
This has been a WBGO Studios production. To learn more about WBGO Studios' award-winning podcasts, special concerts, live streams, and more, visit wbgo.org/studios.